Science fiction. This genre has always had a role to play, whether it be the innovator, the introspective, the adventurous, the critique, or sometimes all the above. They provide bizarre, outlandish spectacles, worlds, and universes, which are for the most part thematically and visually shared throughout the science fiction genre. Sci-fi has always been about pushing boundaries, whether to give a sneak peek into a possible dystopian future, or showcase an alternate reality that challenges the audience's perception of how they understand their own reality. One of the main roles of science fiction as a genre is to make the audience question the world they live in and oftentimes serve to criticize our own society, which can be seen in the relevant issues touched upon in sci-fi texts spanning the last century or so. Whether it be attempts to justify Western imperialism in the early 1900s with the old serials such as Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers, or the questioning of what makes a human in Alex Garland's Ex Machina and Ridley Scott's Blade Runner. With a long, winding, often undulating thread, science fiction's history can be traced back to the 19th century. Arguments could be made that it started even earlier. However, this is the time period that the term science fiction came to be. According to an article by author H. Bruce Franklin, the term science fiction was first used in 1851 by author William Wilson in his book, A Little Earnest Book Upon a Great Old Subject. Science fiction, in which the revealed truths of science may be given interwoven with a pleasing story which may itself be poetical and true. The first sci-fi movie wasn't seen until the turn of the next century in 1902. This was French filmmaker Georges Méliès' A Trip to the Moon, which utilized works from Jules Verne and H.G. Wells. In America, science fiction steadily grew in popularity, using sci-fi as a vehicle to communicate ideas that reflect the era, in similar fashion as the rest of the world. However, during the 1940s the sci-fi scene had died, and didn't resurface in any major way until the 1950s with films like Robert Wise's The Day the Earth Stood Still in 1951, with major texts entering the scene during the 60s like the hit series Star Trek, and the many movie and TV spin-offs of the show that are still being created to this day. Other milestones in sci-fi cinema during this time include the Stanley Kubrick cult classic 2001: A Space Odyssey. Since then, America has produced many sci-fi masterpieces, from George Lucas's original Star Wars trilogy to Ridley Scott's Alien. America has seen its share of science fiction phenomena, the biggest perhaps being the Star Wars saga. The Star Wars franchise, only including movies, has grossed a total of over $4 billion. On that note, this brings up an interesting point about a recent concern most reflected in the responses to the Star Wars prequels. A worry that entirely CGI backdrops, scenes, etc. could heavily damage the elements of sci-fi many fans love, replacing the lovingly handcrafted practical effects with streamlined, fake-looking graphics. While there are some excellent applications for CGI, it can be argued that in some cases the CGI detracts from the experience. Some cases are more viable than not. To say contemporary sci-fi is only worth as much as its advanced CGI is similar to claiming that gaming is only worth the newest console to purchase. Plenty of games from earlier than the last few years still offer valuable experiences, arguably more so than current games, in terms of both enjoyment and provoking thought. Great examples of sci-fi games that combine both enjoyment and introspection over years of releases include the Mass Effect series and Deus Ex series. Even their first releases, now seen as visually inferior today, can still contend to completely outperform more recent games.
The pattern has repeated itself more times than you can fathom. Organic civilizations rise, evolve, advance, and at the apex of their glory, they are extinguished.
Contemporary science fiction is normally meshed with other genres, most commonly action, adventure, horror, and thriller. This isn't always the case, but a larger portion of sci-fi movies are mixed genre stories more often than not. Sci-fi movies share in common many basic story elements seen across the genres: the protagonist, the antagonist, the conflict, sometimes a resolution. One of the things that makes science fiction so flexible as a genre is that it, more often than not, works as a background, or the setting, and enhances whatever genre or genres the work is combined with. When you add this fantastic world or time period, when applied correctly, it brings new depth to your story. Imagine some of the well-crafted sci-fi films without the sci-fi setting. We'll look at Blade Runner. While it could have simply been a detective hunting down fugitives, when adding science fiction into the mix, it creates this bizarre world that the audience can't at first understand. It has advanced technology, but also carries this gritty, dark atmosphere that, in addition to the continuous rain, brings on an ominous weight and foreboding feeling. While it has familiar traits reminiscent in our own society, it also feels very different and immerses ourselves into this new world. Most importantly, this sci-fi backdrop changes what could have been a simple group of violent fugitives from the law to become what this story calls replicants. Artificial beings who are, down to the most minute differences, human-like. They simply didn't have a full grasp of emotions as we humans understand it, and were oftentimes manipulated by their creators. Simply because they are artificial, does that mean that we as humans have the right to toy with them as creators, despite the virtual sameness between us? What does this say about our attempts at cloning and genetic modification? Or simply controlling our environment to the most minute possible details? Is it okay to play God? Near the end of Blade Runner, we watch as a man who attempted to play God was brutally killed by his own creation, which reveals the stance the film takes in regards to this topic. Ironically, it humanizes virtually every replicant character more than even the protagonist himself, Deckard. Though, whether Deckard is human or not is still a topic for debate. At the end of the day, the antagonist Roy Batty simply wanted to stay alive, and while his means were certainly not heroic, we can't really fault his desire to live longer than his allotted 4 years thanks to his creator, Tyrell. This adds a new complexity to the villain, which in turn enhances the movie.
I've seen things you people wouldn't believe. Attack ships on fire off the shoulder of Orion. I watched sea beams glitter in the dark near the 10-house gate. All those moments will be lost in time. Like tears in rain. Time to die.
Ultimately, these grand set pieces are a mask the text creators use to explain problems they see in society today. As I mentioned earlier with Blade Runner, these films more often than not tell us what is wrong with our society, and these films hope to use their popularity to deliver their creators' message to influence their audiences to see a certain way, and shift public opinion one way or another, which will then shift the course of the socio-political and/or technological landscape. America has seen its share of science fiction phenomena, the biggest perhaps being the Star Wars saga. The Star Wars franchise, only including movies, has grossed a total of over $4 billion. On that note, this brings up an interesting point about a recent concern most reflected in the responses to the Star Wars prequels. A worry that entirely CGI We'll look at Blade Runner. While it could have simply been a duck. Do you want it to be a duck?